I'm going to tell you all a little bit of my background. So I grew up in inner city Kansas City. My best friend lived with a drug dealer. My other best friend went to jail for robbing a bank in high school. And um, my drug of choice was workaholism. So I ended up going to grad school at MIT, co-founded a research group with one of the fathers of the internet, and had a life burnout. If you've ever seen the movie Good Will Hunting that has Matt Damon and Robin Williams in it, I was basically Matt Damon's character. It's a movie about someone who comes from a troubled background and ends up going to MIT and having a life burnout. But for me, whenever I had the burnout, it was my experience coming back to God. So that was in 95 and 96. And I got involved in a vineyard church plant, saw that grow from like 5 people to 800 people. And, along the way, I also got involved in ministry, first through a rescue mission at City Union Mission in Kansas City. And then I spent the summer that's completely life transforming in Cape Town, South Africa in 93, I think. And so from all of that, after my time at MIT, I went from working at a Burger King that was also selling drugs. My next job, I was making $200 an hour, working half-time, making $200,000 a year. And basically I quit doing that to move into the hood with a house that had bullet holes in it, and to teach at-risk youth computer skills, and to work with the poor in urban ministry. And then that evolved into Tech Mission, and that evolved into City Vision University. So anyway, that's a little bit of my background and tells you a little bit of my heart. But along the way, I did my doctorate at Bakke University, and I wanted to bridge what I did, had been doing in urban ministry training and nonprofit training, and I wanted to bridge that with my innovation experience at MIT. So I did my dissertation on the topic Disruptive Innovation in Christian Higher Education and the Poor. And out of that, we at City Vision, we've been trying to do some things, in this space that where we're trying to basically develop a new model for how Christian higher education can go. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share some slides with you all. Let me do a shared screen, and you should be able to see the slides now. Oops, wrong slide. Let me skip to the beginning. So my talk is on majority world Christian leadership development and disruptive innovation. I'll explain what I mean by disruptive innovation in a little bit, but let me just talk about what the big opportunity that's happening right now. I think that we are presented with the biggest opportunity in Christian education and history, largely because there's more people than ever time, at any point in history. So especially in higher education. So it took 900 years for higher education to get to the point where there's 100 million students globally. That happened in the year 2000, and in the next 25 years, it's going to grow more than it did the previous 900 years. It's going to grow to 263 million students, and most of that growth is happening in the developing world. So I talk a lot with Christian colleges in the U.S., and they're concerned about how their business model is changing, and many of them are trying to figure out, how do they not shrink given the changes that are happening. How do they not shrink by 5 or 10%? And I try to tell them that's not the interesting question. The question is, how do you grow by 163% just to keep up with the pace of growth in the rest of the world? And ultimately, you're going to have to change your model to do that. So, where a lot of those students are coming from, you got 137 million new students in developing countries. And a lot of those are coming from this emerging middle class, the 4.9 billion middle class globally by 2030. And those of you who are in missions, you've gotten used to a world that looks like this. The rise of the global South. North America and Europe are no longer in the center. The center of Christianity now resides largely in Africa, with a strong pull in the global South and China and other places. So in Latin America. And you all have seen these numbers. Todd Johnson is the one who produces these numbers of the rise of the the West versus the rest. And you know, the West is basically this line here that has plateaued around 800,000, and you know, a lot of those are just maybe nominal, depending on how you count them. Whereas in the global South, you know, by 2025, it's going to be more than 2/3 of the Christians are going to be in the global South. And even more significant than that is where the growth is happening. So 1% of the growth is happening in the West, and 99% of the growth is happening in the South. And you know, I tell people, what corporation in the world, if Apple saw 99% of its growth happening in the global South, it would probably devote 99% of its resources to the global South for growth. But that's not what's happening in the global body of Christ. So, you know, part of what we need to do is figure out how do we, you know, make that shift. And I know a lot of you are part of that. So I like to ask people this loaded question: is education more secular, or is it more Christian globally? And, you know, most people are used to, they came through secular academia and they think, oh, it must be more secular. And, you know, I've tried to find, you know, reliable numbers on this. The closest I can get is that globally higher education is probably around 5% Christian, and the rest is 95%. But really, the question depends on how you frame it. So if you frame it according to Western standards of higher education, then you know, the vast majority is going to be secular. But if you consider church attenders and you compare them to higher education students, and you say, you know, all adult education that's happening, you know, it's 91% to 9%. So, and I think that framing is actually really important. And we can't just all of a sudden say everyone who's in church is the same thing as in college. But I think that there's some distinctions that are worth looking at, because the way we frame Christian education right now is largely the tip of the iceberg. So, and we look at it, and we're really using a Western framework, and we're using, you know, what's largely now a secular framework, and we're saying that the tip of the iceberg. So Bible colleges, you know, accredited Bible colleges, Christian universities, seminaries, Christian liberal arts colleges, they're saying, you know, accredited education is you know, tertiary or post-secondary education. But there's this huge domain that I call non-traditional but accreditable education, and that's growing dramatically. So Bible institutes, ministry experience, you know, missions, training programs, educational discipleship programs. And the reason why this is significant for missions agencies is because, you know, missions agencies have been doing this for a long time, but the rest of the world's starting to change, where they're starting to pay attention to this middle area. And there's a third area where you would call it non-traditional, non-accreditable education. Now, if we accept the Western standards and we accept the secular standards, and we say the only education that's going to matter is what has traditionally been accredited Western education, then essentially what we're doing is the same thing that we've done, you know, whenever we've made mistakes in missions in the past year. So this is a picture off of Wikipedia where, you know, the idea of Christianizing people was you get them in suits and you make them look like Westerners, and you can see all these pictures of these you know, Native American people that they aren't looking happy, but you know, they said we got them in a suit, so they must be Christians now. And you know, I think that's what we're doing right now in the majority world, where we're trying to get them to wear the suits of Western accreditation. And you can't just say there's not going to be any sort of standards, but there need to be appropriate standards and signals, you know, for the majority world. So, you know, in the term higher education versus tertiary education versus vocational education, and how much those are used and how they're viewed, I think that those terms have a lot to do with, you know, some of the bias that gets into this. So part of what I've done is I've spent the past several years talking with hundreds of different organizations and trying to map out, what is this space look like? So you have this, you know, what I call the above water. This is the stuff you can see. You got the Christian mega universities like Liberty and Grand Canyon, you know, almost 100,000 students. Then you have online Christian universities that are through, you know, various accreditors. Then you have Bible colleges. You have other Christian universities, the CCCU, you have the groups that are working with them. You have seminaries, and you have, with the Bible Colleges International, you have ISET, and then you have IPACHI that works with a lot of the other Christian universities. And then you're having this thing that I'm calling church and ministry micro campuses. And this is a new phenomenon where, in the US, we had these big, large state universities, and then we had, smaller community colleges. But now we're moving to the next thing that I call micro colleges. And some of these are fully accredited, like Southeastern. So Southeastern, they have several thousand students that are operating at 50 different campuses that are based in megachurches. It's a very interesting model to look at. And those are accredited, but then there's others that aren't yet accredited, where they're doing similar things operating in churches, but they're basically running universities. And then you have a lot of other things that are out here that make up what I call the ecosystem, and this is non-traditional but accreditable education. So you have Christian, free, and open courses. So Third Millennium, they've developed an online seminary. They invested $34 million in developing a world-class online seminary. They got the best instructors in the world. They put it all online, all for free. Their goal is to reach 100 million people for it. There's very few schools that could say that the quality of Third Millennium's teaching is better than theirs, or isn't better than theirs. So there's this growing phenomenon that's kind of the Christian counterpart to these things that are called the MOOCs, the massive open online courses, like Coursera and edX, whenever Harvard and MIT put all their materials online. So increasingly, there's Christian organizations that are doing that. And then there's commercial courseware. So right now, media kind of has the Netflix of small group material. And if your church wants to subscribe, then you get access to the video library of almost every major, small group curriculum that you might want to use. And Logos is putting their material, and Zondervan and Lou Merritt. And then you have tens of thousands of Bible institutes. And I just gave a talk similar to this at YWAM. So they have their University of the Nations, 25,000 students involved in it in 130 countries, and it doesn't get accredited because there aren't accreditors that cover 130 countries. So what we did is we said, we found a way to accredit their online division, and we're looking at, could we expand that to cover, other programs. And a lot of this non-traditional education is accreditable, and I'll talk a little bit more of how that can work. And there's also a lot of secular resources that are out there. There's the open education movement, and there's open textbooks, and a lot of these other initiatives that we can build on if we're trying to create comprehensive pathways. So a key question is, why now? Missions agencies have been doing this training. And it hasn't been accredited for 100 years. So why should it get accredited now? Why are things changing? Well, the reality is it is changing. So some of you have read this book by Hernando de Soto, Realizing Property Rights. He coined the term dead capital. And basically what he identified is there's capital that the poor globally have, that they own. They own houses, they own property, they own businesses, but none of it's documented. And he said that there's $9.3 trillion in what's dead capital. It's undocumented. And because they don't have that documented, they don't have access to loans. And he's made a pretty good case. I don't remember if he's won the Nobel Prize yet, but I think he's probably going to, that if you can just document all that, then you can probably provide more good to the poor than all the government aid that's happening globally. Another example is in India, where you had 400 million people who had no identification, and the government would try to give them aid, but 95% of the aid would get taken by intermediaries and siphoned off, and all of a sudden, they documented those people. And I would say that there's the same thing in this undocumented alternative education, where there's trillions of dollars of lost value. And why that's significant for Christians is we are the biggest chunk of the pie of that $1 trillion of lost value. We have a ton of people who have competencies that should get them degrees or pretty close to degrees, but we've never documented it. So, all the things that are driving this, one, I just to kind of recap this first section, the rise of the global south. So you need to have a new system that is really based around the needs of the global south, the majority world. There's also a huge growth in bivocational pastors. And what a lot of missions agencies will do is we'll say, you know what, we don't care whether they get a degree because they're working for God, and it's not going to change how much they're getting paid by the church and the missions agency. Well, that's true. But if they're able to get a degree on top of that, and a degree that carries some weight in their bivocational space, say they get a business degree in addition, and a lot of that they learn to be a pastor, but that the last year they convert that into a business degree, they might be able to get paid twice as much as they did in their second vocation, and that enables more time for them to spend on pastoring. So if Paul is able to make tents twice as fast or make twice as much time, or make twice as much money on his tents, then he can spend more time doing ministry. So and the other big thing is there's been a huge growth, and this is really why now it's changing. So there's been a big growth in accreditation systems for vocational qualifications. So 150 countries globally have systems of vocational qualifications. And what these are, I would say these are accreditation systems that are really based around the needs of the South. And they're in varying quality, and the US doesn't have these yet. We're working on it. It's kind of like the English system and the metric system. Everywhere else in the world, they're using the metric system. Everywhere else in the world, they're using vocational qualifications, but we don't use it yet. And then the last thing, and this is really why things are changing now, is there's this growth of MOOCs, mobile apps, and open education, where all of a sudden you got billion-dollar companies that are creating categories of education. MIT and Harvard put all their materials online, and people are saying, I got an A+ on an MIT course, the exact same material that the students went through, I should be getting credit. So there's bills within Congress. There's a lot of action to change things in the U.S. and the rest of the world on how do you grant credit for these things. And I wrote some articles for the Clayton Christensen Institute. So he was the guy who coined the term disruptive innovation, and he coined it. And the basic idea behind disruptive innovation is in industry after industry, you start with a technology that's serving a fairly small market, like mainframes. There's the famous quote by the head of IBM who said there's only a need for 10 computers globally, right? But he was thinking about these giant computers. And then PCs disrupted mainframes, so a tenth the cost at 10 times more users. And then now mobile is disrupting PCs. So there's this term that's used, disruptive innovation theory, and there's a lot of aspects that goes into it. But the guy who coined the term, Clayton Christensen, is a Harvard professor. He's saying that the next industry to be disrupted is likely to be higher education. So the idea there is you have traditional Christian higher education, and here we're serving a few million students at maybe an average global cost of $10,000 a student. And the next tier to greatly improve that is you might get 10 million students at $1,000 a student, and you would do what I call radically affordable blended education, part online, part in person. And it's really not that different than what we've been doing with books. We assign students to read books. It's just instead of assigning books, you also will give videos and other things that they can do online that make it more efficient for everyone involved and reduce the cost. But ultimately, where we're going is radically affordable mobile education. So pretty soon, 5 billion people have access to smartphones, and it'll be pretty easy to have 100 million plus students at $50 a student. Now, I realize that the education you're going to get through that isn't going to be as transformative, but that's where you do the blended combined with that. And ultimately, what's happening in disruptive innovation is the idea is that we're moving from a vertically integrated university. So there's two terms that are often used in disruptive innovation. is unbundling and rebundling. So the idea, so my kids, my youngest son, he loves playing with Legos, and Legos are all standardized. You can break them apart and then you can put them back together. But all his other toys are just stuck together, you know. So unbundling would be, you know, could you create education that's built out of Legos? So right now, most people have argued that the current university is just a bundle. You have to get a degree. You can't say, I want these components, I don't want these components. So you really get 4 things. And if you're familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, the 3 of them kind of map roughly to Bloom's taxonomy. So you have the cognitive, psychomotor, and affective domain. So knowledge and content, and I emphasize low-level content, because I think if you're going to do mobile education, and I'll tell you just a quick story of how this can work. So with both my kids, my 2nd grade son, I told him, if you can go through the 3rd grade math on Khan Academy, the entire year of 3rd grade math, I'll give you $5. And in 2 weeks, he did a year of math, which is more than he did, you know, the previous year at school. And that's low level cognitive stuff. And my actually just this morning, my kindergartner did the same thing, and somehow he talked me up to $7, but he went through 1st grade math and he did it in like a week. So, you know, it's all on their iPads, and you're able to do this lower level stuff that becomes more efficient. And then you got the metacognition and skills. There it's not just the basics of math, it's how does it all fit together. This is really where Christian education, you know, shines, because what we're strong in is how does it fit together? How does it all come together in a worldview? And so that's more the high level cognitive, but also I kind of bundle that with the psychomotor, you know, if you're going to actually do things. So the hand, and often, you know, people will get this, you know, people will say transformation, you know, happens life on life, you know, often. So it happens, and that's the 3rd thing, the affective. And then the last thing is just the degree bundle. So you can break these components up, and what's happening is, you know, 3rd millennium, they've taken the Christian courseware and they got the best in the world, $34 million on lectures. They're going to have better lectures than I do. And there's other things. There's open education. You know, whenever I teach about Clayton Christensen's material, usually I show his video. I don't show my video because he's better at explaining his ideas than I am. So using open books and you know, what happens is university courses then compete. And I had a friend of mine who, he said he was going to Harvard, and he occasionally went to the lectures, but he primarily learned in his calculus course, he learned from Khan Academy. And he said that, you know, his lectures weren't as good as Khan Academy, so he was spending his time doing Khan Academy, and that's where you can learn math online. So, you know, on the metacognition and skills, basically what you're able to do is you're able to break up the faculty position into 4 different roles. So one is the courseware designer. So that's this blue role here, the one that's labeled number 1. Then you get someone who's going to be your instructor online that will do the grading, so your credentialed online faculty. Then you have someone who's much more experienced, much more knowledgeable, and they design your whole program. Usually these people get paid the good money. These people don't get paid much. And then you have local coaches. Now, part of what this does is, in the same way that churches are able to immediately empower, you know, 100 people to lead small groups by providing, you know, prepackaged curriculum, you can kind of do the same thing, and your coaches don't even have to have credentials. So they're just helping people, you know, get the materials. So I use this example with YWAM. This could be for any missions organization. So you could have your own courses, you could have your own campuses, and really for any missions organization, usually it's transformation is going to be the core competency there. And then you have partnerships. So we're partnering with YWAM to provide what's called a top-up degree. So they do the first 3 quarters of the degree in YWAM, and then we provide the final component. So that's what the unbundled market looks like. So, and let me just show you what this looks like. So we've created an alternative accreditation path using UK accreditation called the Global Christian College Credit Consortium. And we've provided a path to a $5,000 degree with most of our partners. And the way it works is we're using the first 3 levels, we're using a vocational qualification out of the UK, and we basically will accredit the partners program. So we're working with YWAM, University of the Nations, we've accredited that, and some of our other partners. And we just charge $100 per year per student for the accreditation component. And that's after the student gets the award. So you're not paying, if a student, it's after they get that year. So your missions agency potentially could do something like this. If your training has to have some rigor. One of the big advantages for vocational qualifications is the people doing the training don't have to have a master's degree or don't have to be a degree above. They can be at the same level. So they have to have completed the training, but they don't have to, if they're teaching at the bachelor's level, they don't have to have a master's. Or if they're teaching at the master's level, they don't have to have a doctorate. They just have to have completed the training that they're going through and have an award for that. And then what we do is, these are about $500 each, and we have a partner in Kenya also where we're doing that, and they're converting their degrees because the vocational diplomas are, they're worth something, but they're not worth nearly as much as an American degree. So they'll convert their degree into one of our degrees here, and the whole path right now costs $5,000, but we're hoping to scale it up. This last year cost $3,500 right now. We're hoping to drive that cost down to, ideally I'd like to get it down to 1,000. I may not be able to get it down to 2,000 because I have to deal with accreditors and all the regulations they have. So the 2 things that's required for partners really, and this is why YWAM was able to do this, for the first 40 years of University of the Nations, they had no central record keeping. So they decided to put all their records into a Salesforce system online, and because they had that, it made it a lot easier to provide the accreditation. The other thing is instructors, doing the grading, as I mentioned, they need to have completed the program that they're doing. And in some cases, even if they didn't get an official award, you can provide a letter validating their learning. So one of the other things we're getting ready to launch is we're launching, hopefully this July we'll get approved, MBA. The list price is $9,600. We're going to, for the first year and to our ministry partners and missions agencies, it'll cost $4,800 in total. But part of what makes it interesting is through these partnerships, people could do the first half through the missions agency. So the total cost to the student after they're done with the missions agency training would be $2,400 for a majority world student who would transfer in 18 credits. And one of the big programs we're going to do is education management, because at the end of the day, we're not about, doing Western education and just, making ourselves at the center. We want to replace ourselves. So how do I train, missions agencies? How do I train indigenous leaders that they may have a great local, Bible Institute, but how do they put that online, or how do they, increase their technology capacity? So, and, one of the visions, I'm with a group that is looking at the idea of how do we create a Christian counterpart to MOOCs, the massive open online courses. And this is, essentially replicating what, edX has done. And this is just an example, but it's a proof of concept. So, Biola could have their program, a MicroMasters in education, and, someone else could have their MicroMasters in social entrepreneurship, and we could have our business administration program. And then other people could have their individual courses. And the idea is you have both these bundles, these MicroMasters or micro degrees, which is, a portion of a degree that could actually count as credit towards a degree, or you could have individual courses. So, and then the mobile vision would be, the Bible apps used by, I don't know if they're up to 200 million now, but, I want them to have a section called courses on there. And then, I'm trying to get them to pair up with Third Millennium, where, they can take Third Millennium courses through the Bible app. So you got 200 million people who have access to world-class college courses. They submit their assignments, and at the end, they get credit, for what they're doing. You could. So that's how someone like Third Millennium could reach 100 million people with their online seminary. So we've launched this organization, or I guess initiative, called the Christian Higher Education Innovation Alliance. Mark's been a part of that. It's a group of about 80 Christian innovators that are focused on education. If you want to kind of, what we do is, it's basically people who like to say, okay, what's the most current stuff? How do we quickly disseminate that information in Christian institutions so that we're able to replicate a lot of these concepts? And that's you know, essentially you know, what we're trying to do with that. So if you wanted to kind of be a continued part of the conversation, then this is the way you could do that. So I think that's basically it for my presentation. I'll stop and just see, you know, what sort of questions or comments that you guys might have on that. And I love having a dialogue on this stuff, because it helps me kind of rethink and you know, revise this type of stuff. So.
Yeah, when I listen to you, Andrew, it's like drinking out of a fire hose.